Hello.
Hi, Emma. How
Hello.
wonderful to be on.
You do. So welcome everybody to this event at the Felixstowe Book Festival. I'm Dr. Hepburn and this is Francesca Specter, author of Alonement. And I am author of a Toolkit for Modern... Oh, great, there we go. I'm author of a Toolkit for Modern Life. I wasn't expecting that, but that's great. And my next book has just been announced as well, which is a Toolkit for Happiness, which is coming out in September this year. So delighted to be joining you in Felixstowe. I'll just introduce myself first of all and tell you a bit about me. And then I'll hand you over to Francesca before we go into the conversation. So I'm a clinical psychologist and I write about well-being and mental health. And my toolkit for modern life is really trying to make these concepts accessible and engaging so you can use them in your everyday life. So what we know as psychologists is that often we know the theory, and we're the best example as psychologists of knowing the theory, but it's actually difficult to remember to apply it in your day-to-day lives. So I illustrate and draw psychological concepts to try and make them more memorable because you drop that image rather than having to remember lots of words. And I shall maybe just flick open to an example in my book. So this is a anxiety image with my character Brian the Brain, who I use to illustrate psychological concepts. So I shall pass over to Francesca to do an introduction to herself.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Francesca Specter. I'm the founder of a platform called Alonement. And Alonement is a platform that basically says this alone time that many of us are a bit scared of or a bit unsure about can actually be a really positive, fulfilling experience. And so I have a podcast called Alonement where I interview guests about the time they spend alone and why it matters to them. And Dr. Emma Hepburn has been a guest on one of the most recent episodes of the podcast. And I'm also the author of Alonement, How to Be Alone and Absolutely Own It, the book we'll be discussing, as well as a toolkit for modern life today. And that is effectively a manifesto for alonement. So things like solitude skills, how to make time alone positive, enjoyable, something that you benefit from in myriad ways, and how to almost impose that sort of framework onto your alone time. And we're going to have a chat today about aloneness across the spectrum. So being alone when it's alonement and being alone when it's isolating and at times lonely. And it's actually quite a convenient time for me to talk about both personally, because I have actually been told yesterday that I'm going to be in isolation for the next 8 days, as I was contacted by NHS Track and Trace yesterday. So really putting those solitude skills into practice at the moment, which I hope that we really get to discuss across the board today.
Okay, great. Thank you, Francesca. So we're just going to really start talking about alonement and how that links to well-being. And obviously, I've been a guest in your podcast. So we've talked about this before, which has been really nice. So we'll continue some of that conversation again. Apologies, I think that's my husband trying to phone in the background, although I did tell him not to phone. So I am also, hence the phone call, alone in the house right now, which is unusual for me because I usually have children and other people around. So I am constantly or by myself very rarely. So for me, it's an opportunity to really get some peaceful time to myself, which is really positive. And I really enjoy that. But that's the positive side of alonement. And I guess it's because I have the contrast of very rarely having time to myself that I really enjoy that. So we're going to talk about the negative side, which is more about isolation, and the positive side today. What would you say makes being alone difficult, and as opposed to my experience right now, which is being really positive for me?
Yeah, it's so funny because for the audience's sake, Emma and I had a conversation over the phone about this last night, and we both realized that we're in vastly different situations in terms of our alone time this weekend. But I think what we possibly had in common when we were discussing it is that we'd decided to put some element of choice onto that alone time. So we spoke and you said to me that you'd been getting really good headway with your work over the weekend. I've committed to really using my solitude skills over the next few days to make this time good. And I think that all important word choice is really where it hinges. So quite often when we think of alone time and we're perhaps not used to it, or we've got it framed in our heads as something that's not our choice, maybe we've got a feeling that, you know, we're not invited to something, or that we, you know, like to be with people. I think that it's very difficult to frame that as alonement that feels like something that's done to you. And I think it's actually by imposing a sort of more psychologically healthy framework onto that time alone that actually you can turn it around and you know, bring it across, you know, to the other side of the spectrum. But you know, I think that those skills, it actually has a lot to do with everything that we talk about in terms of, you know, modern mindfulness, that idea of, you know, being in the moment, that idea of forward planning, that idea of actually putting in a solid framework of sort of healthy practices around that alone time that we might do in other parts of our lives. For instance, in our relationships, we make sure we have quality time with our partners. Making sure we have quality time with ourselves is just as important. And once we sort of build on that, once we commit to that, that's how that time becomes something very different.
Absolutely. So something about choice there, isn't there? There's a choice to be alone, and then it's kind of reframing that to think about being alone as a positive thing as well. And you talk about in your book, you talk about how for a long time you believed that being alone was a negative thing. So I guess it never felt like a choice, perhaps. And I guess I was wondering, when did you start? And you talked very much about you didn't enjoy being alone and you found that very difficult, but then you came up with this concept of alonement. When did you start actually enjoying time by yourself? Do you remember that point when you first thought, well, actually, I'm really enjoying it? And what changed for you around that?
Yeah, you know, I do, Emma, actually. I remember very specifically. So yeah, as a little bit of background to how I even started as an extroverted person who didn't like alone time, starting to try and enjoy it, I went through a breakup at the end of 2018. And that, you know, well, you know, it doesn't really matter who initiates it. It's never really anyone's choice to break up in a relationship because, you know, it's painful. It's like, and I realized that actually my reaction to this breakup was avoiding any time alone. So I was always, you know, going and seeing friends, or, you know, sitting on WhatsApp at night. And even when that time could have been quite healing, being alone, I was just trying to avoid it. And I also said to myself, look, I want to meet someone, meet another romantic partner really soon, so I can keep avoiding this alone time. And it became something that actually was really, really unhealthy. And I'd never quite realized how unhealthy avoiding alone time could be. So, you know, settling for terrible dates, or, you know, going to friends of friends' birthdays in the middle of nowhere, just to avoid a night in with myself. And the moment when I realized this was the wrong approach was I was sat on one of the worst dates I've ever been on in my life, and I was just like, why am I my least favorite person? Why am I not only my plan B but my plan Z effectively? And so I made a New Year's resolution. I started cultivating a bit more time alone, sort of putting in solitude dates for myself in the diary, like planning and scheduling and putting that framework around alone time. And then it was a Friday night. I was having a conversation with my cousin Sam, and we'd been for dinner with my parents, and we were getting the train back together to where we respectively lived. And I was saying to him, oh, I might have a night in by myself tomorrow night. And I felt a bit ashamed of that still, that I didn't really have any plans on a Saturday. And he said, oh, that's great. And I was like, oh, is it great? And I think we sat and we chatted about all the things I could do. He's very cultured. Like, he gave me all these movie suggestions and chatted about what might happen in that space. And I was like, you know what, actually, we've made this seem quite exciting. I think through someone else almost normalizing alone time for me, it was really helpful. And that's what I try and do with alonement now. I think that we can journey towards trying to be alone more, but we don't have to do that alone. We can do that as a sort of alone together thing. We can inspire each other in our aloneness, because the only thing we all have in common as humans is we're fundamentally alone in our own heads. So if that's not something to bond about, what is? And and I think that that's what I love so much about your work, Emma, because I think I said on the podcast, I feel so incredibly seen in your illustrations, because you break down complex psychological concepts, and there's so much more layers of complexity that as non-academics, most of us don't even know about, but you break it down into a way that's accessible, and you sort of normalize everything that's sort of going on in someone's head, and you make even though we can't quite communicate how we're feeling in its entirety, you create that sense of relatability, and that our aloneness in our own heads no longer feels so scary.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, Francesca. So there's so much alignment with my book in your answer, really, because you talk about actually anxiety about being alone, and that's about cultural beliefs, isn't it, about being alone? You talked about feeling quite ashamed about being alone as well, which is really interesting. And therefore, if you have those difficult emotions, we avoid them. But your way of avoiding them, we typically think of avoidance as almost hiding in our house. But your avoidance was very different, because it was almost going out all the time to avoid being alone. But it's the same mechanism. It's that avoidance of those difficult feelings. So actually, it sounds like you had to target the beliefs around being alone, which your friend helped you do, to shift on from that. So I really, really like that description. And I say it aligns so well with the chapters of my book where I talk about avoidance and why we do it. And it's the most natural thing in the world to avoid something that makes you feel bad. We talk about avoidance like it's something terrible, but we're just avoiding those difficult feelings because we don't like them. And then we get relief short term because we don't have them, or we have that immediate hit from going out like yourself. So it seems to work, but longer term, we never kind of disprove ourselves that actually it's okay to be alone. So you then did start being alone, and then you started to enjoy it, which is really interesting. And I guess I'm slightly different to you, because I have always enjoyed being alone. I'm very sociable, but I need time in between to almost recharge my batteries. So I enjoy being alone in my own environment very much. However, there's another, I guess it's where you are alone. So in my house, quite happy, always find things to do, feel totally comfortable, see it's very positive. This weekend, apart from a phone call coming in, which happens quite a lot, I am constantly alone, or permanently alone this weekend, and I'm really, really enjoying it. However, there's a different aspect of being alone, which is being alone out in public, because I have nobody around about here right now. And I recently, 2 weeks ago, bought a Wimbledon ticket. Now, I did just buy one Wimbledon ticket by accident. So I was on the, I got on the website, there was 40,000 people in front of me. I thought, there's no way I'll get a ticket here. I got to the front of the queue, I thought, they'll be sold out, and there was tickets left, and I was in total shock, and I panicked. And you couldn't get 2 pairs of tickets, so I was meant to get 2 single tickets to go with somebody else, but I didn't. I put in the wrong number, and I got 1 single ticket. Of course, as soon as I got back in, it was sold out. So I am going to Wimbledon, if COVID allows, or if the whole regulations allow, by myself. That's a very different thing for me. It's going out into kind of a group of other people by myself. What would you, and I have to admit, I'm a little bit nervous. I'm looking forward to it because it's Wimbledon, it's fantastic. It's actually the men's final I got a ticket for, which is amazing. But I'm also a bit nervous about it. And that's from somebody who enjoys spending time alone. So what would you recommend from your perspective that would help me enjoy going to Wimbledon by myself and kind of getting away from those feelings of nervousness?
That story is amazing. I think probably it's such an easy thing to do, isn't it? It's so hard to get those tickets, and you're at the front and you just forget. So it's that whole thing, I guess, of imposing a sense of choice on unchosen aloneness, really, because it's so natural that we're used to doing. We're habitual creatures. I mean, I live alone. So I'm used to being alone a lot. It would be a strange adjustment to being around people more in a lot of contexts. But I think that it can make sense that being alone in public is so difficult, because even you walk into a restaurant, the tables are set up in two. You walk into Wimbledon, quite often you do see people, you assume people are sitting together. There are all sorts of assumptions that socially we put around in our heads, and it feels difficult to feel like you're the odd one out in any scenario. And I mean, I'm thinking about it, actually. It might be less obvious that you're by yourself in a tennis court situation, which might be an interesting addition. But so there's a chapter in my book where I talk about doing things alone in public specifically. And the first thing that I like to point out is that we all suffer from something called the spotlight effect, which Emma would be very familiar with. So the spotlight effect, for those who don't know, is a social psychological concept where you think more people are looking at you than they are. And this is true of anything in public, but often it comes to being alone. So many fewer people are looking at you than you think. So I think that once you know that, it's a nice thing to have in the back of your head that you're not actually being watched, or it's not like a high school canteen situation where you're being pointed and laughed at. I think also, and you speak about this a lot in your book, Emma, is the idea of being aware in the situation. And I think that often when we're alone in scenarios, what we do, or what I see a lot of people doing, is you sort of look at your phone, or sort of feel kind of retreat into your head, or sort of not be as aware of it as you can be, because there's that self-consciousness, and it can be hard to overcome that. But actually, the more that you commit to something, I find the more you begin to worry less about the fact that you're alone. So for instance, this is true of eating a restaurant meal. You can either, if you're at a restaurant alone or in a cafe alone, you can, gobble down your food and then leave really quickly because you're sort of trying to get it over with as soon as possible. But the more you actually engage with what's going on, you'll kind of forget. And it's that, that's not to say that the first 5 minutes are not awkward, because they always are. And failingly, I still find those first 5 minutes at like the cinema or wherever I'm going alone to be a bit awkward, because I often, it just as humans, if we're the odd one out, it feels strange. But I think that actually it becomes a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy that, the more you try to enjoy it, the more you will enjoy it and be, aware and in the scenario. And, I think that the last thing, and this is the subtitle of my book, Alonement, you have to be alone and absolutely own it, is to own it. I think it's, so I don't know how that would translate in a tennis scenario, but in a restaurant, I always walk in, and I've got a rule with myself that I refuse to just say, just for one. I say table for one, please. And it's having that initial confidence. You almost sell it to yourself. It's a strange one, but actually, just because it's unfamiliar doesn't mean it can't be really enjoyable. So I would love to share this on the Alonement Instagram as well, to hear about this solo Wimbledon trip.
I think during the tennis, actually, I can just really concentrate on the tennis. So it's just like focusing on that. And actually, it doesn't matter. Obviously, you have got that camera effect, a real spotlight effect of the cameras coming at you. So it really amplifies that spotlight effect. But it probably is more about going to restaurants or going to get a drink, which is probably when I spoke to people most anyway. So it's really interesting. So I'll see how I get on, and I shall let you know. And I think just about the spotlight effect, I think that's a really, really interesting concept, and I really like that part of your book. So I used to run an anxiety group with children, and we actually used that technique to show them that actually nobody was thinking, well, not nobody, but very few people were thinking about them. And we did a little experiment where somebody went into the classroom, and it was with children they trusted. It wasn't with a new bunch of people, but it was with children they trusted, and they actually asked them, what are you thinking about right now? And lots of them said they're thinking of me. And if you went around the class, None of them were thinking of them. They were thinking about what they had for their tea. They were thinking about Pokemon cards. They were thinking about this lesson is boring. And actually the people who predicted those people are thinking about me, so that suddenly this 20 people in the class were thinking about totally, something totally random. So it was a really good example of that spotlight effect. Actually, most people, they might notice you, but then they're probably just going to pass over and think about something else like Pokemon cards.
Yeah. Oh, that's amazing. I love that. Yeah, it's an odd consolation, isn't it? Psychologically, no one's thinking about you, but it's kind of in this context, it's really important. I think that it's really easy to sort of hold ourselves back from scenarios because we fear that judgment.
Yeah, and I think we are the center of our own universe, aren't we? We look out into the universe, but that always positively remembering I am not the center of the universe for most people. And I do this with my children when if they're wearing something new and they feel a little bit embarrassed about it, I'll say, people are looking at me as like, do you think that person's going to even remember you when they get home? They're just glancing at you because you've caught their attention for a second. It won't even go into their memory. They won't remember it when they get home. You will not be part of their day at all because you are not the center of their universe. They are the center of their universe.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And so it kind of reminds me also the idea of us sort of berating ourselves when we're alone in public. It's not dissimilar to something we sometimes do when we're alone, which is bring out the inner critic, let that inner critic voice dominate, which is something you speak about a lot in your book. And lots of people avoid alone time for that reason. Lots of people avoid being alone in public for that reason. What are your best tips to turn that around when you're letting that dominate you and make you avoid alone time?
Yeah, that's a great question, Francesca, because I think, we do often avoid the chatter in our own head. And I was on a program with Susan Kallman, and she said, yes, we were talking about being alone, and she said exactly that. And sometimes it is about avoiding the chatter in your own head. It's trying to get comfortable with that, or having to listen to what you normally avoid because you've got other things on. So your attention gets directed to that chatter, and that chatter for many of us can be critical. And there's a lot of brain mechanism reasons for that. So our brain is naturally wired to notice the negative. And we have a really famous psychology paper called Bad is Stronger Than Good. So our brain picks up on negative aspects in the environment because it needs to deal with threats. So our brain then can spot them, criticize them, and criticize ourselves. It's also built into our belief system about ourselves. Quite often we have kind of negative beliefs about ourselves, which taps into that chatter in our head, which can become critical. And when I've spoken about this on social media, it's absolutely brilliant. People often have images of what their critic looks like. And about a year ago, I drew people's inner critics. And we had things like, we had a unicorn, which was all rainbow and pretended it was light and fluffy, but actually it had evil eyes. And so that was kind of representing the fact that often we berate ourselves and think it's positive, like, oh, come on, you just need to do this, get over it. But actually it can be really kind of negative and chip away at you. But often we think we're trying to motivate ourselves, but being quite harsh. I had I can't even say it, an octopus, the octopus, which basically was saying, why aren't you doing everything at the same time? Why can't you manage everything? Everybody else is managing everything. Look at you. You can't manage as good as everything else, while this octopus was juggling 8 different things at the same time. And we had a cockroach, which was just basically a cockroach being nasty and critical. And there's an elf, which is the elf party people, which was saying, if you go to a party, nobody's going to like you. You're not going to have anything to say. You're going to, you're going to be really boring. So it's capturing that kind of themes of criticism that people have, which are really common, but often they're very, very similar across themes. And I think the first thing to do is to almost, this sounds strange, but become friends with your inner critic. And that's not saying you're going to allow it, but that's saying you're going to listen to what it's saying. You're going to listen to the content rather than avoid it. The reason I say that is if we try and push thoughts away, or if we try and push emotions away, they come back stronger. So if you try and say, right, I'm not going to think about that horrible octopus or that elf, as soon as you say you're not going to think about it, you're going to think about it. It's just inevitable. You've almost created the absolute correct conditions to think about it. It's the same with emotions. There's lots of research to show if we try and keep our emotions down, And, you know, if we say, oh, I should just be feeling good, the inner critic shouldn't be making me feel like this, we try and keep those emotions away, they come back stronger. So we actually create stress by trying to suppress our emotions. So the first thing is to spot your inner critic. Okay, it's saying that to me. That actually makes me feel quite bad. So that's the kind of validation that there's something going on. We're not going to try and avoid the inner critic or push it away, because we know if we push it away, it just comes back stronger. You get 5 elephants coming back, or a giant party pooper elf, or a massive cockroach, or a room full of cockroaches. So trying to push them away just makes them come back stronger. So you need to look and say, okay, what am I telling myself? And actually, why am I telling myself this? You know, what's happened? So, you know, you're starting to recognize why you start to criticize yourself, and usually it's really small things. You know, like, you know, it's like, oh, I've not got as good a mark on exams as I wanted to get. It's like, and your critic comes in really strong, really powerful, and starts telling you really harsh things about it. But once you start to notice it and think, right, well, actually, it's an exam. My critic's telling me this is the worst thing in the world. It's going to be absolutely terrible. It's going to be a total disaster. I'm never going to get a job in my life. We can step back from that thought and think, actually, that's not that realistic. That's my inner critic's opinion actually isn't that valid. So we can step back from thought, and that in itself, just even removing yourself from thought slightly, being detached from it rather than involved in it, really helps it. And then there are various techniques, but the one I like best is trying to think from a different perspective. So the example I use in my book is thinking of it as you'd say to somebody else, because we know that we're less likely to be judgmental and harsh to other people. It's not to say we aren't, because we can be, but in most situations, we would say something different to a friend than we'd say to ourselves. So what would I say to a friend in response to she got a D in an essay? Would I say, what a useless idiot, you're never going to do well, you're going to fail university, and you're going to be rubbish for the rest of your life? Of course I wouldn't. I'd probably say something like, oh, that's a shame, that must have been difficult. However, you know, it is one essay. You've done okay in other essays. It's only like 5% of your entire mark. And it certainly doesn't predict your future. You've got lots going on right now. And actually, one essay doesn't define your value. It doesn't define your level of intelligence. It doesn't define you at all. So that's much nicer. And then we can start becoming more compassionate and applying that to ourselves. Because what we know is if we're compassionate to ourselves, then we set off a different brain system, not our stress system, but it's our soothing system, which actually helps us. It creates positive emotions. It helps reduce stress. So I guess the 3 steps are: don't try and push your inner critic away. Notice it, listen to it, but don't believe it. Step back from it. Recognize that it's just an opinion, it's just a thought, and then think, what would I say to somebody else? And start to apply it to yourself. Now, that won't come naturally, first of all. But actually, the more you do it, the more natural it becomes, the more you start to believe it. And I think when it comes to being alone, you know, some of the thoughts that you said in the very first part, when I said, remember when you enjoyed, or you first started thinking about being alone and thinking about enjoying that, you started to almost shame yourself for having to have a night by myself. So your thought was, oh, I have to have a night by myself. And, you know, your inner critic might be saying what that meant about you. So you notice that, step back from it and say, okay, how else can I look at the situation? So I guess for me, for Wimbledon, you know, am I saying to myself, oh, it's going to be terrible, I'm not going to enjoy being alone, oh, everybody will look at me? Then I can say, well, actually, I know the spotlight effect means probably most people won't look at me. Even if they do look at me, who cares? You know, they probably aren't thinking, well, she's by herself. They probably couldn't care less. They're probably too engaged in their own life. And actually, there's a good chance I will enjoy it if I just focus on the tennis and get on with it. And actually, probably when I have been to Wimbledon once before, and actually I sat in a different seat from the person I was with, because we had 2 single seats, and actually I really enjoyed it. So, you know, use that experience from previously to kind of respond to that. So yeah, very long answer, but hopefully I'm going to, you know, it's about building compassion for those thoughts and recognizing them and listening to them.
I think those are such useful tools, because, you know, I touch on it a bit in my book, but not, you know, definitely not to that extent. And I think it's so important. A lot of being alone does just come down to being mentally, you know, emotionally able to regulate, I think. And I always talk about that sitting with your own thoughts as almost the entrance fee to alonement, because before you really have learned to do that successfully, well, not successfully, because we're all a work in progress, but before you've learned that toolkit, as you put it, to deal with your thoughts, then it's not really going to work out. Any scenario from something like being alone at home and something like Wimbledon, there will always be inherent challenges, and those need to be overcome with with that sense of awareness and self-compassion. So I think that that's so it's not just useful, it's kind of fundamental to alonement. And I was
sorry, on you go, Francesca.
I was wondering, so with your 5 pillars that you talk about in your book, so you talk about the 5 pillars to mental health, so to outline them, so they're to connect, to be active, to be aware, to learn, and to give. And I wondered if those pillars, if some of them lend themselves more to solitude, like for instance, I'm just putting it out there, maybe awareness lends itself more to solitude, or some lend themselves more to being social, because of course that's a huge part of our emotional well-being too.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because these are based on kind of 5 ways to well-being, which was a study by the New Economics Forum, which looked at the evidence around what impacts on well-being. And these 5 pillars, as I call them, have the strongest evidence for improving well-being. Now, if we look at connect, now you think, how can I connect about being alone? That might seem totally contradictory, because connect is having good social connections around about you, which is really, really important for well-being. In fact, there's a study at Harvard University, which was run from the 1930s, which shows it's the strongest predictor of positive mental health and physical health and how long we live. So connection, you'd think, should be solely about being with people. However, I would say you can have connection by being alone as well, because connection can also be about connecting with what's important to you, connecting to your meaning, connecting to your purpose, connecting to doing things that you really enjoy doing. And sometimes actually those things might be with people, but sometimes they can be alone. And sometimes if we don't have people to be with, then we think we can't connect in the same way, but we can actually connect to our purpose really meaningfully by yourself. It doesn't have to be with other people. And actually what you spoke about going to cinema by yourself, if you really enjoy films and you connect to watching films and that's really meaningful for you, if you dismiss all that because you're not with other people, you've removed a huge chunk from your life that you possibly can do when you're alone. So it's about recognizing you can have connection. The connection doesn't have to be with people when you're alone, but you can of course connect with people when you're alone as well. You connect by, writing letters. I mean, I still write letters. I love letters. I love receiving things in the post. Me and my friend write letters to each other and send random things. So, I'm connecting with somebody and doing something really valuable when I'm by myself, and I really, really enjoy that. So that's one which I think seems like it should be with other people, but actually you can do alone. And I think awareness is a really good one, because awareness is about being in the moment, being engaging with, for example, nature, being mindful, engaging, being fully present. And actually, perhaps that's easier to do alone, being fully present in the moment, doing something you enjoy, being out for a walk in nature. You probably can engage more with your environment being alone than having somebody else with you distract you. So I do think those elements, or awareness, is something I think being alone really does promote.
We've just got a question through, which I'm going to read out from Marnie in the audience. So the question is, many of us have been alone for extended periods over the past year or more. It's on the screen. Here we go. Do you have any tips about how you can meaningfully use and enjoy this time rather than just worry and feel lonely? Emma, do you want to answer first and then I'll contribute?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, Marnie. I think I'm going to pick up on the worry part, because I think being alone, or our brain is usually active during the day. And the times when worry can tend to set in is when it's a bit quieter. So that might be for some people just before they go to bed. But I think recently it's set in more when we've been alone, and that's obviously been enforced on us much more in the last year. So, and an example of that would be that I see clinically is when people have been working their whole life and suddenly they retire, they have much more time by themselves, and often their worry creeps in a lot more because they're locked. They have a lot more time by themselves. And I think the last year means that worry has crept in. Your brain's almost had space to worry. It's not been distracted to the same extent. And I think, from my perspective, it's first of all managing the worry in the first place, looking at how you respond to those worries, identifying kind of those worries, and there's lots of techniques you can use to respond to that. The ones I talked about with compassion are really important. Recognizing the thought, not trying to shove it away because that just doesn't work, but recognizing it, responding to it, and you can respond to it by thinking, right, is this within my control or is it not within my control? If it's within my control, can I do something about it, deal with it? If it's not within my control, can I let it go in some way? There's also techniques to, for example, say, right, I'm going to have a worry time at 5 o'clock at night. I'm going to put that aside until that worry time. And often we find that we move away from it. And there's techniques when you can directly challenge it around about looking at what the worry is and thinking, how valid is that? And really kind of take your worries to court. So I think it's about recognizing what the worries are or what the content of the worry is. And I think also creating some sort of structure today. I released a book in December around about managing the pandemic and managing isolation around the pandemic. And I think creating a meaningful structure to your day. So thinking about what is meaningful to me, what are those activities I really engage with, what is it I value, and creating that structure throughout your day. And hopefully putting in points of connection in that as well, connecting to people if you can. I know we all got a bit fatigued with Zoom calls, didn't we? And in that first wave, we all got a bit fed up. There was a big kind of effort for everybody to do Zoom calls, but creating those points of connection throughout your day, whatever that is. So that's connecting to somebody. There's actually really good evidence that even connecting to people in our coffee shop. So rather than being your phone, just saying hello actually improves our well-being. So connections doesn't have to be massive, big things of going out to meet people, but having little connections, even if you go out, saying hello to somebody actually improves our well-being, which seems really unbelievable, but there's a really good evidence around that. But also creating points of connection throughout your day as well, if you can. So, scheduling a phone call, scheduling something to speak to somebody, because I think those connections are important. And being alone doesn't mean you don't have to have connection, which is really, really important. I'm going to pass over to Francesca.
I think that's so great. And I love what you said, Emma, about creating that all-important structure, because, I must say, finding out yesterday I will be isolating for the next week, the first thing I thought of is structure. What are my values? What makes me happy, and how can I put them into my life? Because the thing is, quite often structure can come from other people. It can come from our workplaces or, our friends. Maybe we'll plan to go to an exercise class with a friend, but we won't necessarily plan to do that by ourselves, or, we'll plan to do all these psychologically healthy things. So I think, the challenge can often be, without the sort of momentum or the input from someone else, how can I bring these things to my own time and make it, that word that you used, Marnie, meaningful to me. And, so, for me, that looked like I planned the next few days out. I thought, I really like cooking from scratch. That's something I'm going to do a lot, rather than use my Deliveroo Plus membership, which I've used rather too much this year. Home workouts planned every day, planning those things in, what am I going to do on Tuesday night? I've booked myself into an online life drawing class. And, I've really thought about what kind of things psychologically make me feel healthy. And I acknowledge it is harder without other people to sort of bounce off. I do think that it's interesting because you have to be a bit more proactive about it, but actually you end up quite often controlling the situation in a better way. So you'll be more, you'll do, the workout that you really fancy doing if you're doing it by yourself, but you have to impose that sense of structure and choice on your own life. And, I think it's really interesting, the topic of loneliness, because, I myself, I've been, living alone throughout the last few years, but throughout the last year and a half of, the pandemic, with a lot of lockdowns. And I think that for me, self-compassion was really necessary to begin with, to say this is an unnatural state of being. Even in my book, I quite often write that, the balance between being sociable and being alone is really important for, ideally for our well-being. And, it's in a natural time. We're not meant to live in such isolated circumstances. All you can really do is roll with what you've been given when in those circumstances. And I think that it's really, acknowledging that actually, personally, and I hope for those listening, it helped me to feel less lonely because, I knew that it wasn't a sort of blaming yourself for that situation. And then, I think beyond that as well, I think that something that Emma actually spoke about quite a lot on the podcast was the idea of flow. And I'm sure Emma can explain a bit more about what this is from a psychological perspective, but it's the idea of being engaged in an activity where you're not thinking about anything else. And I think that idea of connecting, that all important psychological concept of connecting, that's something that we often think about with other people. But actually, I recently did a mini podcast series of Alonement for Loneliness Awareness Week. And Rakesh Chauhan, a award-winning pianist who I interviewed on the podcast, part of what he said is that sometimes my companion can be my passion. And, for him, that's playing piano, that's composing. And it was interesting because I'd never really thought about that as a sort of obvious cure for loneliness. But, in terms of time where you have no choice but to be physically alone, obviously you can supplement with Zoom and all of that. But when you have no choice but to be physically alone, sometimes actually finding something that absorbs your attention in that state of flow can actually be a really good force for making that time meaningful, useful, enjoyable, and, that can turn it into alonement, even in the absence of other people. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Emma, because you had such a wonder. I really enjoyed what you said about flow on the podcast.
Oh, if only I could remember what I said. So flow really is the state of being fully engaged with something. And to be fully engaged with something, it has to be something you find a bit challenging, but not too challenging that it creates negative emotion. So it has to be a little bit of a challenge, not because you don't want it to create boredom. It also has something that's meaningful to you and that you enjoy, but enjoyment might not come immediately. Enjoyment might come later on, but it's something that fully engages you. So for me, my drawings fully engage me. So actually, I realized my drawings get me in a state of flow. So I am only thinking about the drawings. I am not doing anything else. I'm engaged in the drawing. I'm thinking about where am I going to go next? How will I illustrate this psychological concept? And the time passes in a different way because you're fully absorbed in whatever you're doing. And what you want to do that is obviously reduce distractions. Now, being alone naturally reduces distractions. So you don't want to be looking at your mobile phone. You don't want to be doing other things. You want to be fully in the task. And that has been shown to be really good for well-being, really good for happiness, and it engages us. It creates purpose, it creates meaning. But also if we plan for that, so if I say I'm going to do a drawing at 8 o'clock tonight, then it gives us something to look forward to as well. And that anticipation of a reward is really, really good for our well-being. So I think absolutely connecting with things that are meaningful, doing things which absorb you, which are a bit challenging, which and you probably want to change that slightly. I guess my drawings are different every time. So we're doing the same thing every time, then we lose that state of flow. But for you, cooking might induce a state of flow because you're doing a different dish every time. And so each time it becomes a little bit challenging. It's something you enjoy doing, you can get in the moment. And you can actually increase flow by switching off distractions like mobile phones and by bringing your attention fully to the here and now. So for your cooking, you might think, okay, I'm going to really engage in how does this smell? What does it look like? Notice, what's really going on. And you're really kind of just bringing your attention without distraction to the moment to help create that sense of flow, which is really good. And absolutely, I think making sure you have things to look forward to get absorbed. And creative activities are really, really good for creative activities and sport are really good for creating flow because they naturally get you in the moment. So creating things to look forward to, which can get you into that flow state, can be really, really good because you say if your structure just goes, you don't have anything to look forward to. So putting in those things to look forward to is really, really important.
I love that. It's like, so I talk in my book a lot about, these solitude dates that you plan with yourself. And it's so funny because I think I referenced a study where in the anticipation of a holiday, people's well-being, it actually rises quite a lot in the 2 weeks beforehand. Probably a sticky issue to reference holidays right now, but in the 2 weeks beforehand. And actually that psychological well-being boost is really notable. It's not just the holiday itself. So, it kind of starts the fortnight before. And I think that can, whether it's doing things with other people, which we normally plan a lot more, or doing things with ourselves, which we can plan if we try, that can actually, we can actually get the same boost. And, even if you're not the most organized person in the world, I'm not the most organized person in the world, but I'd certainly think that having that to look forward to, it rebrands it to yourself. And I think that part of it as well is also just putting the same sort of framework, the same sort of structure that you will, if you are planning quality time with a partner, then you'll make sure that you have, put in date night on the Wednesday night. And by showing yourself that same level of esteem, that can actually be a really important thing for like branding the concept of alonement to yourself, which I really like in terms of actually making it valuable. And I love how with the flow aspects of that, you're talking about that sort of level of being aware, learning. I guess my next question was sort of why is it so psychologically healthy for us? Why is it so necessary? But do you think it's because it does integrate a lot of those elements of even giving, I suppose, as well, the giving to the world?
I think it integrates lots of elements of what makes us happy, and also has a physiological response. So it's usually something that we find meaningful. In fact, it generally has to be something we find meaningful that we engage with. And having meaning and purpose in your life, improve your happiness and well-being. Often it's something that we look forward to. It takes away from our worries. It gets us away from that voice in our head to just fully be in the moment. It engages our relaxation system. So physiologically, it improves our well-being because it gets us into a state which is really, really good for us. And it's a bit like mindfulness, but it's kind of looking at it in a different way. It's a bit like being in the moment. So actually it has an effect on your brain, and it kind of, it reduces stress in your brain. So there's some really interesting studies of mindfulness in the brain, and I think flow would have a very similar effect of almost kind of down or reducing those kind of threat areas in your brain, so really deregulating your body system. So lots and lots of different reasons. But I think the meaningful thing is really important. And I'm going to come to meaning, because I see we've got another comment, which I think is really, really important. Because the meaning, we've spoken a few times about the meaning of being alone. So if I start to reframe Wimbledon as, actually, I'm going to get some time alone, that's really positive for me, it starts to have a different meaning. And with the first question, I think, and it's about the meaning of being alone. What does it mean? What meaning are you putting on yourself? Are you saying it means something about you, or does it actually, are you saying it means something negative about you? So looking at what meanings you're making of loneliness, or being alone, not loneliness. Look at the meaning you're making or taking from that time alone, is really important. Are you saying it means something about you negative? Because that's, and it doesn't, but that's what often we do with kind of alone time. So I'm saying being at Wimbledon by myself might mean that I've got no friends. And if I'm saying that, it's going to make me feel stressed. But if I'm saying actually it means I'm going to get a whole day to myself, it totally changes that meaning. And I'm going to move on to the next. It's not a question, but it's a comment. I think it's really important. And I'm going to read it out. So unlike the previous question asker, I find the past 15 months to be a very busy time in a very busy household. I sometimes yearn for loneliness and find it difficult to find headspace or opportunity to nourish my well-being. And this is from Mel. So thank you so much, Mel, because I think this is really, really important. I think there's been two contrast experiences in the last 15 months. And that's the kind of being alone and finding that difficult because there's so much alone time, but there's also the huge business of having children at home. And I would say I fall into this category, which is why somebody being alone for a weekend, which is a very unique experience to me, is really positive. And there's really interesting research coming out from the pandemic about how parents cope with it. And even planning little pockets of time alone, even 5 minutes, half an hour alone, helped parents get through the pandemic. So that was about planning. You're going to take them at this point and do this so I can get some time alone. And just, you don't have to plan something in the time alone. Some parents did, some parents didn't. But actually just having some time alone in itself helped parents cope through a pandemic. And I think that's really important. Sometimes as parents or whoever, if carers or whoever is not able to get that time alone, we usually get childcare to do something. So I am going to the dentist, so I will get childcare, or I am doing this, so I will get childcare. But do we actually usually get, childcare for having time alone? Actually, I think we start to feel guilty about that because we should want to be with our children. We should want to be doing this. I think there's lots of guilt that starts to come in with that. But actually, that time alone is so beneficial for you. Even if it's unscheduled time or unplanned time, not doing anything, if it's time alone just to do something you connect with, you enjoy, even if it's pottering around, it doesn't matter. Really, really positive for well-being. So I actually think, I often advise people to plan some time alone. Don't plan in for scheduling something. Not all of us have the luxury of doing this, but can you plan some childcare to have some time alone? And I think it's not just childcare, it's whatever is using up your time, but can you plan somebody to take over a part of your life so you can have some time by yourself? I found myself sometimes locking myself in the toilet just to get some time alone, but I don't want to recommend. But absolutely trying to, rather than kind of feeling guilty about having time alone, seeing it as a positive thing, which actually helps you look after yourself, nurture your well-being, and ultimately helps you nurture those around you. So having a positive slant on planning, time alone, childcare if you need it for time alone, but finding ways to get that space, getting your partner or whatever to go out to the park for 2 hours and not going with them so you can get some time alone, and seeing it's a really positive thing. And I think it's really, really important.
Yeah, I think, and this is why when I had you on the podcast, it was so important to get that perspective of a busy mum also, because I almost think it's hard at certain life stages to appreciate alone time, and it almost then you become a parent and you have so little of that alone time, and you almost probably feel like, oh, I wish I appreciated it while I could. I was laughing when you spoke about locking yourself in the toilet for alone time, just because I've heard that story so many times from so many parents. In fact, I had another psychologist on the podcast, Dr. Guy Winch, and he said, God, if you ever need anyone to, explain alone time, just find a busy parent, because, they will get it. Alonement is just instinctive, it's unsaid. And I think that, the other useful thing, and, I think it's difficult with, it depends on the nature of the busy household. It's difficult with very young children, I imagine, for instance. But I think that having the concept of positive alone time, of even having the word alonement, I would say that I coined it, but, having that language is so important, because it almost encourages everyone around you to respect it and maybe value it for themselves. For example, to give an example, when I first started navigating the idea of alone time, I grew up in a household where my mother and my brother, they're both very introverted. And so I would see them in the morning, kind of having a quiet moment with the paper or the crossword or whatever. And don't get me wrong, I never understood it as this sort of needy extrovert for years and years and years. But actually looking back and reflecting, I kind of seen it modeled how you can enjoy alone time. I kind of seen it modeled how that can be a positive experience. And I think that creating that sort of almost like household culture around alone time can be really useful with older children, or with a partner, with housemates, with friends, all of that. I think that actually, if possible, and there are many scenarios where it wouldn't be, it can actually be a real force for almost connection, because we all know that if we've not had enough alone time, we can get tetchy, we can not feel our best selves just because we haven't had a time to reflect. And this is a massive luxury for me to be able to say, because I do get a lot of alone time, but even sometimes when I've been on group holidays in the past, I've felt, oh my gosh, like because we're not a group of people who are naturally together very often. We haven't set any amount of boundaries around what alone time would and should look like. So I think that actually creating that language and that conversation can be really beneficial on a wider level, on a group level.
Yeah, that's interesting. Obviously, none of us have been away with groups of people for a long time, but when I go in groups or away with groups of people, and the last time I did was last year or 2 years ago, I'm losing track of time now, just before the pandemic hit, I went with some friends, and I used to go out to the bakery in the morning to get everybody baked goods, and everybody was so grateful, but actually it was just my chance to get some time to myself. It was a half-hour walk to the baker, or a 50-minute walk to the baker and back again. But again, that's interesting, because I was almost making it acceptable by going to get our breakfast, but actually what was wrong with me just saying, actually I just need some time alone, so I'm going to go for a walk? So it's about kind of seeing the value and not having to justify it. Just, it's okay to have time alone and need time alone, and actually it's essential, particularly as a busy parent. It actually gives us more headspace, because we are so busy the whole time, constant demands, which is stressful, that it's a requirement to nurture yourself to have time alone. And that's not always possible. And that's sometimes really difficult. But then coming back to the Wimbledon story, I told my friend about it, and her response, she just looked at me and went, "Lucky you. That's my dream. A whole day to yourself." And that made me go, yeah, actually, I'm framing this totally wrong. Not silly me. I almost should have deliberately just got one ticket to have a whole day to myself, because that is like an absolute luxury as a busy parent.
Was it actually deliberate, Emma?
Reframe like that, I probably would do it again, but it wasn't. I was going to go and try and get from my husband as well, but obviously that's not happened now. So my day to myself.
Oh, subconscious move. Yeah, it's amazing. I always think how many people take up running on holiday. It's like, you're not a runner. Why are you going out for a run? It's no one wants to say, but it's But then you come back, and you're absolutely revitalized in so many ways, and you have more to give to the group, or significant other, whatever. It's really alonement at work. I think alonement on holiday. Hopefully going forward in the next few months, some of us will be able to experience navigating that a bit more. And
not needing an excuse for it, not needing to go to the baker, not needing to see you go for a run. Actually, I just need some time alone, and that's okay, isn't it?
Yeah. Although pastries and endorphins are probably a nice outcome, but
yeah, true.
I'm aware we're coming up to time, so I wonder if anyone else has any other questions. Otherwise, I think we're coming up to the hour here.
I just think it's fascinating, Francesca. You've got bananas on top of your book. I've got a brain on top of my book here. I'm not sure what that says about us, but I notice we've both got props on the top of our book. Yours matches.
What does that say about the nature of our content? Mine is apparently bananas, but yeah, I picked it up like here. I couldn't resist the matching color. Oh, we've got another question coming in. Which so I'm going to read this one out. So from Rob the Greek, it says, do you think that COVID will create more people who crave aloneness or less? Ooh. Okay, I'm gonna start off with this answer. So I think kind of as Emma was alluding to earlier, like that we're gonna have two very different schools of people. There's the people that kind of have come probably as soon as lockdown restrictions were lifted, they're like, get me back to whatever social activities I can, because it's just been too intense in this hot house, or get me back to being able to do things alone, and not worry that everything has to be home based, even if that's going to a cafe alone, going to a cinema alone, all of that. It really does create that polarity if you've been around other people and you've been forced to be around them, even if you love them. You will start craving that sense of independence. But then on the other hand, and I speak quite candidly about this. I think that when I came out of lockdown, especially when I think back in before April, when we couldn't even really go for walks with people, it was imbalanced, and so I think I almost needed to top up my sort of balance of being sociable. I needed to check in with those friends and family that I hadn't been able to see just in order to get that sort of sense of equilibrium. Again, I mean, I think that, for many people, it will possibly come back to, similar to where they were before. I think that hopefully it will have been a chance that people discover not necessarily aloneness, but, alonement for the good, because, actually having been deprived of it so long in a busy household, they will have realized that actually, how important it is to factor in, to proactively factor in, rather than it just being, what used to be their commuting time or their gym time or whatever. And I think even people who have had, who have not even out of choice been a lot more solitary during this time, I think perhaps the coping mechanisms they would have found to deal with this, certainly I've discovered a lot more things that I love to do alone. I do. It turns out I quite like home workouts, and it turns out I quite enjoy, cooking for one. That those discoveries, I don't think they'll go away. What do you think, Emma?
Well, I'm just going to speak as the voice of nearly every parent who's had to homeschool. I think we're all desperate for time alone. So, but again, I think it depends on the context, doesn't it? It depends where you've been. If you spend lots of time alone, or if you've had no time alone at all, it will depend whether you crave it or you crave company. And also probably will be a degree of anxiety of coming out of lockdown as well. Certainly there's a lot of anxiety coming out of lockdown about spending time with people, and that's slightly slightly different, I should say, from craving time alone. That's maybe slightly anxious about seeing people that we have to manage as well. So I'm just aware we're at the end of our interviews here, and just want to say about Francesca's book again. So I don't know if you've got a copy to hold up, Francesca. There we go. Alonement, How to Be Alone and Absolutely Own It. It's a great book, really interesting and really enjoyable book, really good read. So highly recommend Francesca's book.
And likewise, Emma, I absolutely adore all the work that you do. But yes, A Toolkit for Modern Life is a really wonderful and beautifully illustrated book that is, basically everything you need to have that foundational sense of being comfortably in your own head that is so, so necessary before you even start thinking about comfortable aloneness. I think getting to grips with your thoughts and having that toolkit is just all important.
Well, thank you very much. It's been great to speak to you again, and I'm sure we will have a future podcast at some point to continue the conversation.
Yes.
So thank you for your questions as well.
Thank you everyone for listening.